And he has given himself to Baha'u'llah, really. And as a result of it, he says, I believe. That is when the first spark of faith appears in our hearts. Just like a mother who has given birth to a child. This is just a form of looking at nature to see what happens there. Now, when you look at nature, you will find that the mother who gives birth to a child, the first thing she does, if you notice, she loves that child very much. And the next thing she does, she will feed the child. And the child has never been fed before in his life. Never tasted the milk. And none of us can remember what it was like when we first received the milk from our mother. But it must have some effect on us, on the child. It gets the taste for it. And the next time, it probably wants, it's not going to reject it. It becomes more and more fond of that milk, to such an extent that it will cry for it afterwards. And he wants to drink this milk. And this milk makes it grow. This is nature. And the mother will feed the child regularly. Regularly. Now the same thing applies exactly to our faith. When you say, I become a Baha'i, it's a dangerous thing to remain like this and just remain in that state. We must feed our faith. We must feed the spirit of faith which is born. We must feed it with some food. And the food for it is the words of God for this age. This is why Baha'u'llah has commanded us. This is one of his commandments. He says you must read, you must recite, he says. Recite my words. Recite my words twice a day. In the morning and in the evening. He stipulates that. Recite my words in the morning and in the evening. It's just like a mother who says to her child, eat your food 2 or 3 times a day. You see how similar it is? And Baha'u'llah mentions to us, if we don't recite, what will happen to us? You can imagine what will happen to us. What will happen if a child does not eat his food? Baha'u'llah says, if you do not read my words, it's a very serious situation. He says, you are not steadfast in the covenant. Our soul, if it is to be healthy, it must be steadfast in the covenant. If it is not, it's a serious situation. And this is when the believer becomes confused. He's a Baha'i, yes. But he has never taken a food, or very little. And so he becomes frustrated. He cannot see joy out of his faith and out of life. Just like a person who does not eat his food. I remember a few years ago, one young person came to me and he said, you know, he said, it's 1 year that I'm a Baha'i, but I don't feel any difference. I'm the same person as before. Can you imagine, when you become a Baha'i, can you imagine what happens? We have to be different. One has to be very different. Very different. It's a new life. This is the second birth that Christ is talking about. The spirit of faith is born. It must be the most exciting thing which happens, just like an excitement which comes to a mother. There is no excitement in the world for a mother greater than to have given birth to a child. And this person said, well, I don't feel any excitement. I'm a Baha'i for a year, but I've not grown, I've not changed, I'm just like the old days. I'm not excited about anything. What is wrong with me, he said. Well, you can imagine what's wrong. You know, I mentioned to him, I said, have you ever loved somebody? Because you must remember, the faith, you cannot only become a Baha'i through your intellectual appraisal and intellectual investigations. You might begin with that way, but you have to fall in love, really. Your heart must accept the faith. You must fall in love. It's a falling in love. To be a Baha'i is that you have fallen in love. And of course this is a relative term. It varies from person to person. One person's love for Baha'u'llah is not much of a love for another, in another case, of another person. Everyone is in different levels. We are all in different levels. This is a relative term. But to be a Baha'i means that you have come to love Baha'u'llah. This is what it amounts to. You can understand it, yes, you must study it and everything else. I don't know how you become a Baha'i, it's not important. You might become a Baha'i through purely an intellectual approach. But then if your heart does not move, and if your heart does not fall in love, because I mentioned we have to give ourselves to, we have to give our soul to the influences of the revelation of Baha'u'llah. It is just like a marriage. When you are marrying somebody, you love that person. You see? Now here it is. This young man was telling me, he said that after a year I don't feel any difference. I said, have you ever loved anybody in your life? He said, yes. Now let us see what happened that you love this person. Really, let us examine it. This is nature again. What happens that you come to love somebody? The first thing, you meet that person, isn't that right? And when you meet that person, you like that person. And when you like that person, you come a little closer to that person, isn't that right? You come a little closer. And when you come a little closer, you like him more or like her more. And when you like her more, you come still further closer. And you come closer and closer and closer. And it comes a point that you want to know everything about that person. Isn't that right? You want to know everything. And you're going to ask even people, what is this? Tell me all about it. And I'm sure if somebody rings you up in the middle of night, 2 in the morning, and say, look, I've got some news for you about your friend. Would you like me to tell you? Oh, yes, please tell me. You're not tired of it. You become excited. You see, you are beginning to fall in love with somebody. Oh. And so, this is how you fall in love with some person. So I mentioned to this young man, I said, when you heard of Baha'u'llah and recognized him and said you are a Baha'i, did you ever come a little closer to him? To Baha'u'llah? Did you ever allow yourself to come a little closer to him? No. Did you ever read anything about the history of his revelation, really, to find out what was going on in all this? Did you try to find out anything about him? No. Did you read any of his writings? No. Did you care to carry out his teachings? Exactly. See what he has said, let me carry them out. No, he said. Well, what do you expect? You have kept your distance. And now you want to be different. Of course you're not. You're the same person. You're just like a mother who has given birth to a child somehow. But it's gone now. It's not there anymore. It's very little of it left. And this is why I said it's very easy to become a Baha'i. But to grow in the faith is the greatest challenge and the greatest difficulty. But we can learn. We can learn from nature and we can learn from the writings of Baha'u'llah. And as I said in the morning, everything that he has said, it fits into nature. Now this very teaching that he tells us, this very commandment that he tells us we must read his words twice a day, in the morning and in the evening, is just as vital as eating the food for a child. And you see how much similar it is to nature when he says do it twice a day. You know, in life it's the same thing. If you eat, you cannot lump together all your food and eat it once a day. You can't do that. It's not healthy. You eat something in the morning, then that something that you eat in the morning, you have to give it time to be digested. And when it is digested, then you become hungry again. And it is a sign of digestion is that you're hungry again. Then you will eat again. Baha'u'llah has given us the same commandment. He says, read my words in the morning which means when you read it, you mustn't just read it and forget it, but rather allow it to penetrate into our hearts. Penetrate into our hearts. And when it penetrates in the heart, then the sign of it penetrating in our hearts, what we read, is that when we come home in the evening, you are eager to read again of the writings. This is the sign. If I come home and I'm not eager to read, it means what I have read in the morning, or if I have read it, what I have read in the morning have not penetrated into my heart. And there is again a challenge. What are we going to do? How are we going to enable the words of Baha'u'llah to penetrate into our soul? And now what I'm trying to tell you in a way is this, that in life you have to do so many things to live in order to enable you to live. Isn't that right? In life you can't just say, all right, I'm going to eat only and then I'm going to live. No, you can't do that. You have to do so many things to enable you to live in this life. You have to eat, you have to sleep, you can't do without it. You have to breathe air into your lungs, you have to wash, you have to dress, you have to go shopping, you have to work, you have to have friends if you want to live. You have to do all these things, and if one of them is not done, if I say I'm not going to shopping ever, well, you can't live really. You must go for shopping. You have to do all these things. It's like in electricity, it's like, you know, these switches which are in series. If you put a number of switches one after the other, you must close all the switches so that the current may flow. If one of them is open, nothing will happen. It's the same thing in the faith. You become a Baha'i, now the task begins. You have to close switch after switch in order that you may live happily and grow, our faith may grow. And one of them, the first one, was this reading of the writings in the morning and in the evening. It is such an important commandment that nobody can ever emphasize this point enough, how important it is to make it a habit for ourselves to read the writings. And you know, to form a habit is difficult when you are grown up or when you become a Baha'i. You've never been reading the writings before, so to form a habit is difficult. It's all right for children to learn it. A child will learn it and make a habit of it. But to read the writings when you are grown up, you have to force yourself at first, until it becomes a second habit. And it doesn't matter, we must not be worried about it. If once there is a lapse in this, you may do it for a week and then you forget it. Doesn't matter. Try it again. You forgot it for another week, okay, doesn't matter. God is forgiving, of course it is. You just take one little step forward, He comes to you 1,000 meters. Doesn't matter. Do it again, so that it becomes a habit. So that the goal of a Baha'i really is to become an addict to the writings of Baha'u'llah. This is the goal. And you know how you become an addict? Now you must know, or must have heard of, I don't think you're addicts yourselves to anything, but people who become addicts to drugs, what happens to them is somebody introduces the idea to them and eventually give them a little piece to try. The child becomes an addict to the milk of the mother. And we have to become an addict to the writings of Baha'u'llah. And I will probably, in the course of next sessions, will talk about it, of how should we read the words, so that we may become really addicts to it. Now, I think when they're children can learn this when they are young. And we should teach our children from childhood to make it a habit of reading the writings in the morning and in the evening. Then they grow and it becomes natural for them. Now, there is one point that I must mention here. It's a very important point. What is the writing? We must not mix it with prayers here. We are not talking of prayers. Prayers are different things. We do it differently, and I'm not going to talk about it now. Prayer plays a very important part in our life. But reading the writings of Baha'u'llah is a very different thing altogether. The writings are those things that you come across in English now. Many of these writings are available to us. The Gleanings, Book of Gleanings is full of the writings of Baha'u'llah. The tablets of Baha'u'llah lately published by the House of Justice. These are the writings of Baha'u'llah. There are other books which are not prayers, of the writings. The Hidden Words is one of the writings of Baha'u'llah. And there is a vast difference between reading the writings and saying prayers. In fact, these two things are sometimes opposite things. Very opposite. A prayer and a tablet of Baha'u'llah are opposite things. I will explain to you how. When you say a prayer, you often ask God for something. But when you read the writings, it's God who asks you to do something. It's very different. You see how different it is? And we have to be differentiating this very clearly in our minds. And especially if you are teaching our children. I note that the children of all the Baha'i families, they are taught prayers. You know, most children learn prayers. But we should have a program, every home, where we can see that, we show the children the difference between reading the writings and saying your prayers. We could say, all right, say a prayer, but let us now read the writings. And pick up something for them, which they can read. So that it becomes a habit for them, and they can distinguish between the two things. In our meetings, well, this is my own taste now, if you like call it. This is just a taste, personal taste. I feel we should say prayers, but equally we should read the writings when we gather together in a meeting. When we have a devotional program, you can say prayers, you can read the writings. Now, Baha'u'llah has again here applied the same laws of nature to this particular commandment by telling us that we must not read the writings when we are tired. He said, read as much as you are enjoying it. As soon as you become tired, don't read it. Do you know what it is like? It's like a mother who says to a child, eat your food as long as you're hungry. As soon as you're full, stop eating. This is it. You see, very natural. All these teachings, as I said, have their origin in nature. Now, we must also, I'm going to, the time is coming 12 o'clock. I think I'm going to tell you a story. There's much we have to cover in this field. We haven't even touched upon this properly. Of all the things we have to do, as I said, there are a lot of switches we have to close in order that we can enable our souls to experience that growth and that joy of faith. A growing faith, not a static faith. A static faith for a Baha'i is fatal. You know, something which is always the same. But he says we must allow our faith to grow day by day. And we must feel it, just like a mother who feels that his child is growing. And he's happy for it. Now I'm going to tell you a story, which is a true story, and I don't think it's made up. It relates to one of the early believers of Baha'u'llah. Now this is a very well-known, one of the well-known apostles of Baha'u'llah. One of the apostles of Baha'u'llah was called Zainul Muqarrabin. It doesn't matter now the name to you. He was one of the outstanding disciples of Baha'u'llah, one who really had a great qualities of knowledge and learning, and his particular work was, at one stage in his life, was to transcribe the writings. You know, transcribing the writings was a very important task, because when revelation came to Baha'u'llah and his amanuensis would write it very fast, so fast that you cannot read it. Revelation writings, you can look at revelation writings, it's not possible to read it. The way revelation came to him was so fast and there is no shorthand in Persian or Arabic languages, that his amanuensis had to use a special technique fast. He had very large sheets of paper, very large sheets, piles of them. And when he was writing, he found out that you cannot use, if you hold a pen in your hand, and normally we used to hold a pen in our hands and we begin to write by moving our fingers. When you're writing, you move your fingers. When you move your fingers, you can't write very fast. But he used to hold a pen like this within his fingers, but he wouldn't move his fingers when he was writing. He would move his wrist. And so you can write big, one letter would maybe, one word would take the whole line maybe. And it would be, each word would go into each other. All the words would go into each other. Quick, 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 he would write them down. Because remember, revelation came at the speed of 1,000 verses in an hour. The Kitab-e-Iqan was probably revealed in 3 or 4 hours. Because when this person sent the questions to Baha'u'llah in writing, 48 hours later, the Book of Certitude in its original form, in the handwriting of Abdul Baha, was presented to him. It didn't mean it took 48 hours to be revealed. It meant that Baha'u'llah had to eat, had to sleep, had to do other things during that period. 3 or 4 hours. The revelation is like this. And so when it was written down very fast, then he had to go to his room, the secretary of Baha'u'llah, the amanuensis of Baha'u'llah, and rewrite it again properly. And then he would bring it to Baha'u'llah. And Baha'u'llah often would pace up and down the room and reveal that tablet as if he knew it all by heart. And this man would check it, and any corrections were made. And then when it was properly done, then there were people who would transcribe it, because there were no typewriters in those days, or no printing machine. People were transcribing. Abdul Baha was one of those people who used to transcribe the writings during Baha'u'llah's ministry. Now this man that I'm going to tell you a story of, and we are getting late, was one of those who used to transcribe the writings. But he was a very meticulous man, very meticulous in his work of transcription. So meticulous that he used to check it all, everything he wrote, he used to check it with his son. He would call him after a few pages that he would write, he would call his son, and the son would come and read for him the original tablet, and then he would check what he has written. And this is how the writing of Zainul Muqarrabin, anything you find in his handwriting is authentic. It's a standard for Baha'i publications. You always compare every publication with his handwriting. Now, he had a great sense of humor, this Zainul Muqarrabin, and he often came to the presence of Baha'u'llah, and he always had some humorous remarks to make. And as I said, Baha'u'llah loved humor, good humor. One day he came into the presence of Baha'u'llah, and he said, he said to Baha'u'llah, we in our family, we of course carry out your teachings, but we are particularly have a favorite amongst your teachings. Each one of us have a favorite of one of your teachings. And so Baha'u'llah said, well, what are they? Well, he said, my son has a very special favorite. He said, every day I write many pages, because this was his work, this man's work. He said, I write and write and write, and then when it's all finished, I call my son to come and to read for me the writings, so that I can check them. So he comes in, he reads 1 page, and then he turns to me and he says, Father, I am tired. And Baha'u'llah says, when you're tired, you must not read the writings. This is his favorite teaching. And Baha'u'llah laughed very much. Then he said, my wife has another favorite. When I have done a lot of work and very tired and exhausted, I say to her, would you make us a cup of tea, please? She says, go and make it yourself. Baha'u'llah says, men and women are equal. This is her favorite. Well, now, friends, I think we'll leave it here. And we will come back. Do we come back this afternoon sometime? At what time? Maybe you want to announce it so that we can... Ted, you have given me all these papers, and some of them are your indexing notes on it. Here we are. So I wouldn't have that. Well, you all must have been nourishing very well, huh? Have been nourished very well, I should say. Well, I think we better continue the subject. We were discussing or talking about still the reading of the writings, the reciting of the writings of Baha'u'llah in the evening and in the morning. And we said it's the spiritual food. But it is very important that we should remember that what we read, what we recite, should allow it to penetrate into our hearts. And I am not I'm not going to give you any methods for doing that, because after all, every individual is different. But when we read the writings, if we do not allow it to penetrate into our hearts, as I mentioned, it's just like a food that you take which you don't digest it, and it is of no value. You know, if we want the words of God to penetrate into our hearts, we must first know something about the Word of God, not to look upon it as the words which we ordinarily read in our daily life, because we are all so much engaged in the act of reading. We are so good readers. We begin a book and we end it up quickly or after a short while. And I've seen people who get into a train and they open a book, and till the end of the journey they're reading. Now you can't do that with the words of God. If you want to read it in that way, it's no use. We have to know whose words we are reading, and this is the key to it. Whose words is it that we are reading? And here it opens up really. This subject now opens up a vast, many questions. Whose words am I reading? If somebody says, well, I believe that Baha'u'llah is his words are the wisest counsel that anybody can give, or he says Baha'u'llah's words are the most profound words that you can find, or if he says that Baha'u'llah's words are having all the solutions of the problems of the world within it, this is not at all what Baha'u'llah's words are. This is not what Baha'u'llah's words are. He is not the wisest man. He is not the greatest man. He is not the most profound, learned person. He is the voice of our Creator. You see now? He is the voice of our Creator. He is the supreme manifestation of God. You cannot compare it with anything that man has ever had or has ever got, except the manifestations of the past, whose words we don't have adequately. Now here we see, therefore, our attitude has to be right when we read the writings. Whose words am I reading? This is the words of my Creator. Not until you believe that can those words penetrate into your heart. But if you believe that, then when you open the book, when you touch the book, it means something to you. It already has moved you. When you touch the book, when you handle it, when you open it, You open it with feelings of joy and excitement. I'm reading the words of my Creator. You know, in this life, our Creator, that's God, communicates with His creation. All creation, not only man, but all creation, every created thing, God communicates with it. But this communication is in the form, in different forms. For example, and when I say God, by the way, let us be make it very clear. I mentioned this morning, we are not talking of the essence of God. You cannot talk about it even. The essence of God. We will never understand it. The manifestations of God do not understand it. Let alone us. We are not talking of the essence of God. The essence of God can have no connection whatsoever with His creation. If it ever has any connection with the creation, then He ceases to be God. You cannot attribute anything in His essence. These are some of the profound statements that you will find in the writings. You cannot attribute anything to God in His essence. The minute you say God is the all-knowing, you limit Him immediately. The essence of God you're talking about, because you're limiting Him. When we talk about God, it is God which is revealed in this creation, which is manifested in this creation, not the essence of God. So let us make this point clear. So when we say that God communicates with all this creation, man and other creation, when we look at nature, we find this is true. For example, you will find God communicates with all the living creatures through the rays of the sun. This is the way He communicates to them. Communicates energy to them, which enables them to grow. The energy comes from there, and that is what it is. It's a form of communication, pouring out its energy. And you know, when the energy is poured out from the sun upon all created things, those created things which are alive, they yearn for that energy in their own ways. They yearn for it. They long for it. You know, a tree which is living, a tree will stretch its boughs and branches towards the sun. This is just yearning for this energy to reach it, as if it's conscious that these energies are giving it life. But it can't help it. It just stretches itself towards the sun. And if it doesn't, it's dead. Now, on the other hand, you realize that whether the rays of the sun pour upon the tree, whether the tree stretches its branches or not, still the sun is pouring its energies upon it. But a tree which does not stretch itself, it's dead. You see, it's a two-way communication. This is prayer. You know, prayer. This is the state of prayer for man. The tree, when it stretches itself towards the sun, it's exactly what the soul does when he prays to his Creator. Now, a prayer is not something that you always ask God for something. The best prayer is the one that you don't want anything. A prayer without any desire. A prayer of praise and glorification of God is the best form of prayer. And if you look at the writings of Baha'u'llah and Bab and Abdul Baha, you will find that the greater part of their prayers is that of praise and glorification of God. Just like the sun, like the tree, which stretches its boughs and branches as if it is praising its Creator. It's the sun, the rays of the sun. The real prayer for man is to stretch its spiritual branches and boughs and branches, the spiritual arms, the spiritual heart, towards his Creator and praise and glorify Him. This is the best form of prayer. But what I was saying is that God communicates with His creation, and the sun pouring out its energies is one form of that communication, and it is constant. Now, the tree, of course, is bound by the laws of nature to respond in this way. It doesn't have any voluntary power. It cannot refuse to do it. This is the way it's made. This isn't how nature made it. But we have the choice. Again, remember, man has the choice. You have the choice of either turning to God or not. Absolutely. If you turn towards God, well, the powers will be released. Now, I mentioned that God communicates with His creation. But how does He communicate with our souls? Because our souls is not subject to the laws of nature. Everything is subject to the laws of nature, which is physical. Our bodies are subject to the laws of nature. But our soul is not. Our soul is subject to the laws of the covenant of God. And there you will find there is a covenant between God and man in the act of creation, which means that we have to turn to Him. He releases to us spiritual energies through the Word of God, through the word of His messengers. And we have, like the tree, to stretch ourselves towards it and want to receive it and open our hearts to it. So the way He communicates to us, to our souls, is through the instrumentality of the words of Baha'u'llah in this age. So you see, this is God communicating with us, with our souls. It's a communication. And so when you look at the words, when you open the book, and if you look at it in that light, and as you open the book and you look at the words and say, this is how my Creator is communicating with me, is talking to me, asking me to do certain things. This is what it is. This is the writings. He asks you to do certain things. Then it becomes a very potent influence. It will produce a potent influence upon our hearts to say these words, to read these words, to recite these words with great excitement, to approach it with great reverence. This is the word of my Creator. And then those words can penetrate into our hearts. And there is also to realize that the words of God is very much unlike the word of man, is created. It's a bad thing to repeat things, you know. You have got the story of repeating, haven't you? Have you heard? You know about it. Very good. Repeating is not a bad thing, because we often forget things. But I was saying this afternoon, that we must allow the words of God to penetrate into our hearts. And if the words do not penetrate into our hearts, then it is like food that you eat, which is not digested. But to allow the word to penetrate, we must really have the knowledge and the faith in whose words we are reading. It's very important to know whose words we are reading. They are not the words of a very wise man, or the wisest man, or the most profound, learned personality that you are reading, but it is the words of your Creator. Far, far above, far, far beyond any human understanding are the words of God. And that I was mentioning that God communicates to His creation. Communicates. This communication is for all created things. You remember I was telling you the story of the sun pouring out its energies upon all vegetables and animals and every created thing. That's the way it communicates. And it sends out all the life-giving energies. But the tree must stretch its boughs and branches before the sun. And if it doesn't, then it is dead. Whether it does it or whether it doesn't, the sun is pouring out its energies. But a tree which does not stretch forward is dead. And the same thing is with the soul. Our souls must yearn for God, to praise and glorify Him. This is the best form of prayer. The more you get closer to Baha'u'llah, the more you want to praise and glorify God. Now, this is one aspect of the word which I mentioned. We must remember. So when you open the book, you must remember